Once you have found your perfect homestead property, the last thing you want to have happen is this. I'm talking about things that were outside of your control and even outside of your property. Something that if you would have just pulled the lens back a little bit more, you probably would have seen. A lot of people, when they're buying a property and don't have experience on land, they get into a situation where they look at a property and the pictures look good, it all looks good, and they do the site visit and they're like, yeah, this is a pretty nice place. The price is right. It looks nice. It's got things that we need. There's resources there. But just 2 miles away, there was a chemical factory that had an explosion. And their property was contaminated for life. That's an imaginary scenario. Having said that, it's not too far off from things that have happened in recent history. And it's quite common, actually. The main thing here is understanding what threats are around you that aren't necessarily on your property. This is what I do when people pay me to consult for them and say, hey, I want to look at this property and this property and this property. Once I already know their context and what they're looking for, the first thing I'm looking for are any visible threats in the immediate area, because that will just be an immediate disqualifier and then that property's done. So this could be things like even living close to wind turbines. They're incredibly noisy and they put off a freakish amount of electromagnetic frequencies. And they're gaudy. And I'm all about, I hate the term sustainable electricity, but I love energy independence in whichever form that comes. However, wind is one of these things where it's kind of a nothing burger. It's just a government racket. It's just an insane amount of resources to produce less energy than you would with just solar. So, but either way, it is a liability to be close to that, to be close to, or be in an area that is really prone to forest fires, and not having any elements on your property that are going to protect you from that event if it were to happen. There's socioeconomic risks. You could be near an area where you've got, you could be, say, right on the Mexican border, somewhere in Texas, where people are crossing over and there's crime and child trafficking and crazy shit like that going on. These are threats that can greatly impact your life on your property, but aren't from your property. And it's so important to look for threats. Pull the lens back, see what's in the sort of, call it 6 mile, 10 kilometer area. Go back to the 60 mile or 100 kilometer area. What is around you? What are things that could affect your livelihood that aren't on your property? Because most people just think about what's on their property. Now, threats on your property is also very important too. And that could come from a number of things. It could come from some really poorly done forestry, where you're in a property like a CFA climate in the sort of southeastern US, where you can get huge rain events and you get massive amounts of flooding or topsoil erosion. That's a threat that could exist on your property. That could also exist off your property. You could be downhill from a clear cut that covers 100 acres, and in an event where you get a huge rainstorm, if any of that water makes it through your property, you're in trouble. And this is one of the bad side effects of improperly done forestry and clear cutting. Hey, no bark, quiet. Is that this creates an environmental problem, because without trees, the ground just can't hold on to topsoil in the same way. You can with really thick grass, but that isn't often in places where you see clear cuts, especially in places like British Columbia that I'm in. So the point here is these threats need to really be looked at. And most people don't think about any threats that are in the area, but it's really important to think about these in a variety of different ways. There's threats that can come from a climate that you're in. There's threats that can come from the topography or the landform that you're on. Like I said, with mismanagement, with forestry or things like that. There's threats that can come from water. You might be on a river and that's your source of water, but just upstream from you is something toxic that you don't want in your water. There's socioeconomic threats. You know, if you're living close to places like Milwaukee, Chicago, Atlanta, LA, you know, San Francisco, especially places that have just become, you know, hellholes with crazy liberal policies that have just degenerated the culture and the city. You don't want to be close to that. What happens when there's a food crisis and you're living close to a city like that and everybody wants to get out at the same time and your property is en route out of the city? You don't want to, you know, be in that kind of situation. That's a socioeconomic threat. You could find a threat in any regard. Socioeconomic threats would also be things like industry that's close to you. We built this course called Finding the Perfect Homestead Property, which is what the series of videos you've been watching are all about. But we looked at some places that had crazy socioeconomic threats, in that one property in particular that we looked at in Arkansas was a beautiful homestead property, huge acreage. It was 50 plus acres, if I remember correctly. And the buildings and everything was really well set up on this property. It would be a great place to just benefit from the vegetation and wildlife, had good topography. There was water on the property with ponds, perfect, you know, even good buildings and infrastructure. But just a couple miles away, surrounded by industrial, intensive chicken farming, where there's one bird a square foot, and it's just hack them and pack them and stack them, and it smells terrible. It's an environmental wasteland because there's no synergy in those productions with the affluent or the whatever it is that comes out of those buildings. It's just a nightmare. So you don't want to be near that. But that's a threat. That's a socioeconomic threat. And so we've built this course showing you how to analyze a property using these techniques. And threats is one of these things that the first thing you should look for. Once you understand your context on a property, what you want, what are your, in our last video we talked about negotiables and non-negotiables, what are those for you? Then the next thing you want to look at is a threat. What's a threat in this area? And so this is, of course, with the assumption that you've looked at a property that you've narrowed down, that you want to take a closer look. It's one thing just to scroll through realtor.com and just like disregard properties in a second. That's your first layer of filter. Your next filter is to actually go, okay, I want to dig deeper on this one. And the second thing you want to look for after you understand your context, the first thing you want to look for really once you understand your context, is what's an immediate threat that could disqualify this property right away. Because the more time you spend on a property, the more you have invested in it. And so you want to disqualify a lot of things right out of the gate by first just looking for threats, because that's going to be an easy one. You know, you could be less than a kilometer away from a cell tower. You don't want to be near a cell tower, especially with if a lot of these have 5G now. You don't want to be too close to that. You don't want to be too close to a power line. Sometimes properties will have commercial power lines going through, and they're 100 feet away from the house. You don't want a scenario like that, but that's another socioeconomic threat. And so you want to look for these things right away, because this is the first filter in a way to help you disqualify places. Because if you want to look at the most amount of properties in the least amount of time, the first thing you need to do is disqualify 9 out of 10 and keep filtering down to the gravy, basically. Filter down to the stuff that's worth looking at and investing the time, because you're already going to make an investment in that. It should be in properties that are at least a maybe. So that's part of this greater framework that we're going to lay out in these next videos, where we explore each. From here on, we're going to start exploring the layers of permanence, the scales of permanence, as P.A. Yeoman built them, but we're going to use the 11. I think P.A. Yeoman started originally with 7 or 8. We're going to go through each layer of permanence or scale of permanence and discuss how these things are important on your property. So if you're enjoying this series, stay tuned for the next one. We're going to talk about climate. And if you want to learn more about this course that I've built, that I'm very proud of and excited to share with you, because I think it's going to help a lot of people get on the land, It's homestead.freedomfarmers.com. There's a waiting list there. We're going to be announcing the release date of this course. It'll be sometime in April, mid-April we're shooting for, but we'll send you an email with more information, early bird pricing, and of course the release date. So look forward to seeing you in the next one.